Cari amici, illustri colleghi, buongiorno a tutti. Vi porto il saluto e il ringraziamento dell'Accademia Nazionale di San Luca. Mi scuso di non averlo fatto subito oggi ad apertura di convegno, ma un impegno non me lo ha reso possibile. Quindi arrivo, come dire, in medias res. Ho chiesto all'amica Sabine Frommel come procedesse e mi sembra assai bene. C'è un dato importante per l'Accademia, ma poi in realtà per tutta la cultura nazionale e internazionale in questo nostro convegno, ed è l'architettura. Può sembrare paradossale, ma se noi andiamo a verificare nella storia recente dell'Accademia Nazionale di San Luca, se noi andiamo a verificare il ruolo, il peso, il significato che lo studio della storia dell'architettura e la prassi architettonica, che sono in fondo i presupposti su cui l'Accademia è nata e si è sviluppata, sono stati un poco messi in opera. Gli accademici stessi di San Luca da tempo denunciano, nel senso buono della parola, questa carenza nella cultura italiana e non solo. Però in quella italiana particolarmente noi ricordiamo sempre, quando si svolgono gli incontri accademici, ricordiamo sempre il significato profondo del motto accademico. Il simbolo dell'Accademia è un compasso sopra il quale appare la scritta equa potestas. Significa naturalmente la pari rilevanza delle arti del disegno, ma quel motto è presentato da un compasso, cioè dallo strumento per antonomasia della misurazione e della capacità dell'occhio di organizzare la percezione del reale e fissarlo in strutture, senza bisogno di risalire a Leon Battista Alberti o a certe teorizzazioni di Francesco Di Giorgio Martini che so io. È sempre stato riconosciuto in ambito accademico come l'architettura sia, per così dire, la madre di tutte le arti e il luogo sovrano dell'esercizio del disegno, che è il generatore dell'Accademia. È vero sì che l'Accademia di San Luca nasce dai pittori fondamentalmente. Il primo presidente fu Federico Zuccari, però se noi andiamo a leggere sia i testi teoretici e anche quelli letterari di Zuccari e andiamo a esaminare quale fosse l'impostazione delle lezioni accademiche che si svolgono, molte sono perdute sia nei titoli sia nei testi, ma qualcosa rimane, e cioè di quello che accadde non qui, perché non era qui, come ben sapete. La prima sede dell'Accademia di San Luca non era in questo palazzo è arrivata molto tempo dopo, a seguito delle demolizioni dell'area di Via dei Fori Imperiali, come ben sapete. Quindi questa è una sede recente, ma il senso non è certo cambiato. Tutta la prima fase delle lezioni accademiche a San Luca, tenute quasi molte dai pittori, in realtà vertono su questo, e e cioè in verità è l'architettura che è l'arte maestra, e su questa base tutto segue. Perché l'architettura è generata dal disegno? Perché disegno vuol dire progetto, per antonomasia. Disegnare vuol dire progettare, questo già lo dice Zuccheri, lo dice Tommaso Laureti, il grande pittore con competenze architettoniche rimarchevoli, grande maestro bolognese. È conservata qualche lezione di Laureti, questo dice Laureti. Perfino nel linguaggio colloquiale della lingua italiana, l'utilizzo del termine disegno per significare il progetto è ravvisabile in molti ambiti disciplinari. Ancora oggi, quando alle Camere, alla Camera dei Deputati, al Senato, viene presentato dai soggetti abilitati a tale scopo, viene esaminato un progetto di legge o di regolamento, la lingua italiana usa ancora la parola disegno. Si chiama disegno di legge quello che viene presentato all'esame, perché è la circoscrizione di un concetto. D'altra parte, tutta la nostra vita è condizionata da questo. Non c'è forse persona a questo mondo, dottissimo o ignaro che sia, che non ha la chiara percezione che la prima arte con cui si trova a dialogare è l'architettura, perché quando veniamo a questo mondo viviamo in qualche ambiente, in qualche struttura, perfino le capanne, è vero, di determinati popoli che naturalmente non definiamo più primitivi, ma che comunque riflettono un contatto con la natura diverso dal nostro. E tuttavia noi tutti impariamo l'arte e anche la storia dell'arte in qualche modo semplicemente vivendo nella città. Da bambini noi non sappiamo che è l'architettura che condiziona le nostre vite, però lo sappiamo nell'esperienza reale. E allora la storia dell'architettura è in effetti, nell'ambito di una struttura come questa, un nutrimento indispensabile. Ciò viene detto continuamente. Da quando io ho avuto l'onore di essere stato designato alla funzione di segretario di questa accademia, cerco di svolgere tale funzione proprio in questa ottica, favorendo cioè in primis gli scambi di idee tra gli accademici medesimi. Ma in che senso? Non solo in senso teoretico, in senso pragmatico. Ci sono accademici architetti che esercitano la loro attività nel campo del restauro e della progettazione, seguendo un filone di pensiero e di operatività che scaturisce dal dibattito accademico. Ma questo vale anche per molti dei pittori e degli scultori che sono da tempo o anche da tempi recenti iscritti all'Accademia. E l'esigenza della cognizione storica, della critica storica, oserei dire meglio, è un pane quotidiano degli incontri accademici, ma c'è poi chi, come voi, questo lo realizza concretamente. Poc'anzi parlavo con l'attuale presidente dell'Accademia, un grande scultore italiano, il maestro Paolo Icaro, e lui stesso faceva questa considerazione. In questi giorni da noi in Accademia c'è un momento di alta verifica di quel tipo di incitamento che nella cultura italiana in particolare, ma non solo, ha radici antichissime. Ricordo che quando in piena età napoleonica, quindi un'età di fervori eccelsi, venne ripristinato su volontà peraltro di Napoleone stesso, uomo certamente molto attento alla dinamica culturale nelle arti figurative quanto altri mai. Bello sappiamo, bello seppe il nostro principe Canova quando si recò, dopo la caduta di Napoleone, si recò in Francia per recuperare su incarico della curia papale, all'epoca naturalmente il potere costituito nel nostro paese, si recò per recuperare il maggior numero possibile di opere che le armate napoleoniche, dopo il trattato di Tolentino, quindi tra l'altro in una forma quasi regolarizzando un saccheggio di guerra, cose che sempre succedono, non successero solo con quel trattato, erano lì, erano a Parigi. Canova si recò a questa missione diplomatica che ebbe un esito felice intendo per il recupero delle opere, e nella sua veste di ispettore generale delle belle arti, una funzione che gli era stata conferita già molti anni prima, e di principe dell'Accademia di San Luca. L'Accademia di San Luca aveva tra le sue finalità peculiari quella di favorire il restauro, la conservazione e lo studio del patrimonio artistico. All'epoca non c'era la parola patrimonio, ma il concetto era quello. E ancora una volta il sogno supremo di Canova, principe, e dell'Accademia stessa sarebbe stata la culminazione di tutto questo impegno di promozione, di creazione e di conservazione. All'epoca del Canova questi due termini non erano così separati come nella prassi attuale. Il grande sogno di Canova era quello, nella sua patria, nel piccolo paese di Possagno, di costituire, di creare un tempio, un'architettura simbolica che sarebbe stata poi la sede laica e religiosa al contempo del retaggio che il grande maestro si accingeva a lasciare. E disegnò lui stesso, ispirandosi naturalmente ai grandi monumenti romani, al Pantheon in primo luogo, disegnò lui stesso il progetto del Tempio, che fu realizzato e ancora oggi possiamo vedere e apprezzare. Canova aveva proposto una sorta di operazione scaturente da un attento esame della storia dell'architettura. Compì un'operazione che in qualche modo noi oggi, con metodologie diverse, con mentalità diverse, con dottrine diverse e con una scienza diversa, comunque sviluppiamo. Quindi avere questo convegno qui nell'Accademia di San Luca non voglio dire che sia un valore aggiunto, la validità del convegno è in sé e rimarrebbe tale in qualunque sede si svolgesse, perfino quella ormai consueta elettronica. Non di meno però l'architettura è un luogo, non è così fungibile il fatto di esaminare le nostre tesi su uno schermo dove guardiamo e dove veniamo guardati e non piuttosto nello spazio fisico. L'elettronica si perfezionerà sempre di più, l'intelligenza artificiale arriverà credo senza dubbio a riprodurre i processi di pensiero e di elaborazione. Le seconde e le terze realtà si svilupperanno, ma comunque tenderanno al ripristino di ciò da cui sono partite, lo spazio fisico, che è il luogo supremo della vita, ordinato dall'architettura e dall'urbanistica. È possibile che tra i percorsi che il futuro compirà, lo sviluppo progressivo sempre più ampio appunto dell'intelligenza artificiale, della trasposizione cosiddetta virtuale, della concretezza della realtà, è ben possibile pensare che alla fine di questo circuito si tornerà da dove si era partiti, cioè allo spazio reale e all'esigenza dell'essere umano di essere ordinato, guidato, di apprendere attraverso la progettazione architettonica. Credo che quindi il senso di questo convegno e i suoi contenuti abbiano da un lato uno specifico riflesso nelle competenze e nei desideri promanati dall'Accademia di San Luca e nel contempo ambiscono a quella universalità da cui i nostri studi sono generati e verso cui vanno. Credo che i risultati di queste ricerche siano concreti, cioè possano spingere noi stessi e le generazioni che verranno dopo di noi a restare incardinate alla reale conoscenza delle cose, della storia e degli strumenti reali della creatività, reali, qui è una parola impropria, ma insomma di quelli essenziali. Quindi io mi permetto di dire che per noi questa è una lieta occasione e mi auguro per gli organizzatori fonte di soddisfazione, di nuovo progresso e nuovo sviluppo degli studi. Vi è un risvolto di amicizia che non credo disdicevole. Io sono legato da antica, profonda e direi coinvolgente amicizia con Sabine Frommel e con Christoph, una figura per me di riferimento e di continuo colloquio mentale e diretto. Il retaggio di questi grandi studiosi è portato qui nell'Accademia e è chiaro che abbiamo tutti noi l'orgoglio, il senso dell'orgoglio che non è presunzione, ma è consapevolezza di trovarci in una sorta di res pubblica eruditorum di cui i nostri antenati tanto hanno parlato, hanno cercato di praticare questo modello culturale. Questo modello culturale è in questo convegno, quindi vi esprimo, cari amici, veramente i sensi di grande stima, ammirazione e rispetto verso il lavoro che si sta svolgendo. E mi scuso anche di averlo interrotto, perché in definitiva questo mio saluto fa un po' ritardare lo sviluppo dei lavori, e non c'è cosa più sgradevole in un convegno di cominciare a guardare, non dico l'orologio perché ormai si guarda il cellulare, insomma, notando come i tempi slittano e quindi non dico oltre, mi ritiro perché tra l'altro è in corso in questo momento un incontro accademico nostro di una certa rilevanza per l'organizzazione della vita dell'Accademia e devo di necessità seguirlo. Vi ringrazio di cuore, vi esprimo davvero il più grande rispetto, affetto e stima per quanto si sta facendo e mi ritiro in buon ordine per consentirvi la prosecuzione del dibattito e dello studio.
Dopo queste belle parole di segretario dell'Accademia, appunto seguiamo la sua indicazione di proseguire con i nostri lavori. Io sono Henrik, sono una professoressa associata di Storia dell'Architettura presso Ca' Foscari di Venezia e sarò la chair di questa sessione. I'll speak in English because it's a very international section, and I'm very glad that I'm very glad and very grateful to Sabine and Henrik that we can actually continue our conversation on history of architecture and history that we began 3 years ago in Munich. So it's a great pleasure to introduce more international view on architecture, more international views on architecture history in Europe. Our first speaker is Rona Sadan. After MA studies at Harvard University, she is currently a PhD candidate at Aarhus University in Denmark. And her research interests actually are focused on the fortune of medieval art and architecture in Scandinavia in the 19th and 20th century. So without further ado, I'll leave the floor to Sabine, please.
Thank you very much. The mic is on, everybody can hear me? Yeah, great. So I'd like to thank you very much to Henrik, Karge, Sabine, Frommel, and Claudio Strinati for organizing this symposium and for giving me the opportunity to speak. And I'll start without ado. So Denmark is a small country with an artistic and architectural tradition that until the rise of Danish modernism in the 20th century has arguably had a negligible presence on the world stage. It was in the early 19th century, with the rise of romantic nationalism, that Danish archaeologists and historians began taking stock of their nation's artistic and architectural legacy and to assess its place in relation to the influence of the dominant European powers. They sought to define what was distinctively Danish or Scandinavian or Nordic in their country's painted, carved, and built heritage. The initial answer was very little. In the words of the first Danish art historian, Anil Hoyen, "From our pagan ancestors we received no art. Foreigners brought us Christianity, churches were erected and decorated. We received the impression of Norman, German, Netherlandish art, but a time span of more than 500 years was not able to give the foreign a distinctive development in this country." This is the beginning of a famous lecture Hoyen gave in 1844 after having been on a tour of Italy and a sojourn in Germany between 1822 and 25, and having completed the first inspections of Denmark's medieval monuments between 1829 and 33. The lecture is considered a foundational moment in the ushering of the Danish Golden Age of painting, the country's first self-consciously national art movement. Seeing no autochthonous artistic traditions for artists to draw on, Hoyen urged them to seek inspiration from their country's natural landscapes and folk traditions. Hoyen's dismissal of centuries of artistic production because of its perceived foreignness was itself informed by imported post-Renaissance aesthetic standards that led him to treat dismissively the local artistic productions. For instance, the medieval wall paintings that deck the walls of many churches in Denmark and which were rediscovered in the first half of the 19th century. So this is the earliest uncovered and restored example. These were considered by many critics as entirely rootless importations, to use the kind of rhetoric of the 19th century. Degraded copies, they thought, of Byzantine or German originals. The story of their reception is the topic of the dissertation I'm currently writing. When it comes to some of the church buildings in which the wall paintings lived, though, certain ideological and aesthetic prisms led the archaeologists, historians, and architects working in Hoyen's wake, that is, in the second half of the century, and really they were working also with him, to perceive a Danish or Nordic character in these structures, even though their styles were largely derivative. In analyzing these churches, the Danes' approaches were informed by theories by, for instance, Goethe and Semper about the determining impact of geology, climate, and local materials on the artistic output of a given culture. When restoring these edifices, they followed Viollet-le-Duc's notion of stylistic unity. So again, as ever, the Danes were importing foreign ideas and applying them locally. In this paper, I'm going to focus on how a group of Romanesque granite churches, of which this one is an example, concentrated in the peninsula of Jutland, which is really most of the land of Denmark, you see up there, captured the romantic imagination of historians and architects and became symbols of Danishness. The fascination with the materiality of granite led this stone to take on a deeply symbolic value with great repercussions for Denmark's medieval monuments. But before I delve into granite, let me just sketch out in very broad strokes what Denmark's Romanesque architectural heritage consists of. The first stone churches built in Denmark date to the 11th century. During that time, and until the 17th century, Denmark also controlled southern Sweden. So, of the kingdom's great cathedral, Lund, which is in today's Sweden, was built first, mainly of sandstone, starting in the early 12th century. Its style is Rhenish Lombardic, similar to the Cathedral of Speyer and Mainz. This style was disseminated from Lund to the region's other Romanesque cathedrals, Ribe, which was begun in around 1150, which was mainly constructed of volcanic tufa imported from the Rhineland, and then Viborg, said to have been built mostly of granite, or at least partly of granite. Roskilde was originally a travertine church built in 1170, but the current cathedral was built over it in brick through the 12th and 13th centuries. Each of these cathedrals represent one of the main building materials used in Denmark, and each is associated with a group of churches built of similar materials and forms. Many of Denmark's medieval churches, of which there are circa 2,000, were built during the reigns of kings Valdemar I and II between 1154 and 1241, which was also when Denmark reached the zenith of its imperial power. The triumphant Valdemarian age was the object of much nostalgic imagination in the 19th century, during which Denmark suffered a prolonged territorial decline and painful military losses, most importantly to Prussia, during the Second Schleswig War of 1864. The conflict with Germany created a great antipathy for any sign of its cultural influence, which impacted how, quote-unquote, German styles were evaluated aesthetically. So under these political conditions, and I just want to point out that it's hard to see, but the blue dots represent granite churches. So there are quite a few of them especially in Jutland, or Jutland. So under these political conditions, all churches built under the Valdemars were cherished, but granite churches were particularly prized for several reasons. One was their picturesque connection to the forbidding Jutlandic landscape, which had been newly, quote-unquote, discovered by romantic poets and painters as the new old heartland of Denmark. The previously largely ignored, thinly populated, windswept heaths of western Denmark became an object of fascination for artists searching for Nordic authenticity. Architects like Fritz Uldal, the author of a volume on the churches of Jutland, tend to include picturesque descriptions in their texts. For instance, the granite church's serious expression harmonizes well with the grandiose forms of the surrounding nature and with the mood of the landscape, in which they have been over the centuries, by one generation after another, always anew attracting the gaze and thought of the wayfarer. The aesthetic appreciation of these churches is reflected in the fact that in 1865, the artist Jacob Kornerup, who was also the most prolific restorer of wall paintings in Denmark, exhibited watercolors of granite churches, of which this one is a likely example. Kornerup wrote several articles on stone materials in medieval churches, and in a text from 1870, he waxes poetic about the beauty that make granite churches, like Hague Church here, quote, stand out as mighty mosaics with glorious brilliance of color, only dampened by centuries of moss. The appeal of the church's connection to the landscape was fortified by a new scientific awareness of the natural processes that made their creations possible. In the 1860s, new geological theories led to the understanding that the granite boulders, now called glacial erratics, a beautiful name, of which Jutland's churches were made, had been deposited in the area during the Ice Age, and were originally part of what is now the Norwegian mountain ranges. So in a sense, they were also imported a long, long time ago. Denmark's geology is very poor in natural stone. It's mostly chalk. And these enormous boulders were a wondrous, near mythical presence in the landscape. Many folk legends were connected to them, part of an oral tradition that became the object of enthusiastic research by historians on the hunt after distinctive traditions. One of the legends about the Dupel stone, seen here, was that it was thrown by a giant troll who got upset by the sound of all the bells ringing and all the new churches being constructed in the area. Trolls throwing stones at churches was a common motif in these legends, which often make appearances in architectural histories, since very little writing survives from Denmark's Middle Ages. And there were some architects who really took offense, or not offense, but were really critical of these, using these legends in what is supposed to be modern scientific scholarly literature, but there was really very little history that has been written before that. So as approaches to these monstrous masses became more scientific, testifying to the primordial nature of the Danish landscape, their role as part of the material culture of the Danes' primeval Stone Age and pagan ancestors also became understood. Archaeological research into dolmen megaliths and standing stones took off in the early 19th century, together with literary and artistic attention and popular curiosity. The first two directors of the National Museum of Denmark engaged the public in recording and preserving these artifacts, cultivating a sense of civilizational continuity between the ancient then and the modern now, pictured here with the contemporary artist recording the scale of the Stone Age dolmen with the medieval church in the background. The sense of continuity, of course, hinged also on runestones, which marked the transition from Viking paganism to Christianity, and which had been the object of antiquarian activity since the 17th century. The sense that Nordicness was expressed in these stone carvings led nationalists to espy a subtle Nordic stamp on Romanesque forms. So, for example, the Scandinavist author Karl Rosenberg, who's really a popularizer of Høyen's understanding of Danish art history, speculated that perhaps behind the hewing of stones for so many granite churches, quote, lay an old domestic skill. It would not be so strange if the descendants of the rune carvers found it easy enough to acquire new ways of treating stone. Our old church rooms bear witness to considerable aptitude among the northerners of that time. So this was a way of kind of ginning up, patriotic or nationalist pride in these carvings. As research into the churches progressed through the century, the historical continuity was affirmed, also between the stone material and the wood churches that preceded it, exemplified in surviving wood churches, stave churches in Norway. And this is an example of a surviving piece from a stave church. So the archaeologist Sophus Müller, if you notice this design, the archaeologist Sophus Müller found 10 churches, and this is just three of them, in whose tympana transitional Viking Romanesque motifs are visible. They are now known as the loop churches, after this motif, which had recently been argued to combine serpentine Viking forms with a figuration of two bishops' staffs, with one hook each above the church entrance. Jakob Konerup saw in such examples, quote, an art that was originally a foreign guest in the north, but soon became the full spiritual property of the people. Oh, sorry. So an art that was originally a foreign guest in the north, but soon became the full spiritual property of the people, so that it can truly be said to have become a national art. Here I'd like to pivot to the kind of appeal the granite churches had in their function as spiritual spaces. And this relates back to the interest in oral traditions, which was inflected by the Lutheran revival movements of the 19th century, with the most important player being the pastor and public intellectual N.F.S. Grundtvig, seen here. Grundtvig's influence on Danish culture is inestimable, and his valorization of folk orality and the importance of preaching in devotional life reverberated deeply. At a time when architectural revival movements offered ever more diverse possibilities for spiritual atmospherics, the question of what kind of spaces best facilitated the transmission of the spoken word was crucial. Høyen perceived the Romanesque basilica as the structure closest possible to the ancient simplicity of the Apostolic Church before Catholicism was corrupted and cast off in the Reformation. As he and many other Protestants saw it, compared to the Gothic interiors, with their manifold visual distractions, the Romanesque basilica's channeling of the congregation's attention to the altar and the apse was more conducive for focus on the ceremony. And I'd like to point out in this painting that it's a view of Ribe Cathedral in 1836 that was actually painted under Hoyen's instructions, in the sense that the artist deleted certain architectural additions that were done later, and he, in the painting, he restores the church into the more ideal Romanesque basilica form. In Hoyen's words, the simpler stylistic forms which we, through the Christian church, have inherited from antiquity exert their special attraction. They have a clarity, a calmness and peace, which form a glorious harmony with the preaching of the word. Well, this was true as much for Romanesque churches built in travertine or tufa as it was for ones built of granite. Granite had a special value. Its hardness enforced a decorative simplicity that took on a moral valence. As Kohn put it, granite necessitated the construction of buildings with a, quote, austere primitiveness that also has something serious and dignified about it. The fact that, end quote, the fact that so many churches were established with such careful hewn blocks of so forbidding a material, quote, testifies to the Jutlandish people's extraordinary patience and perseverance, unquote. And in many writers' judgment, it also reflected their piety. This assessment allowed Danish historians and the congregations who worshipped in these churches to imagine their ancestors as God-fearing in a solemn, stoical way. And later research has agreed with this. The historian Otto Norn has observed in the 1980s that the Jutlanders' careful shaping of their ashlars was indeed expressive of piety, following liturgical authors like Honorius Augustidonesis, who ascribed a greater mystical perfection to a square stone, and likened such stones to members of a congregation who hold together the spiritual edifice of the church by prayer. Norn thus reads the Jutlanders' careful hewing of stone, a kind of, he reads in it a kind of anagogical aesthetic experience. Even before much of the scholarly research into the granite churches was published in the 1870s and 80s, granite was redolent with associations of devotional authenticity, so much so that its visibility was codified by law. In 1861, a, quote, law of church inspection was passed in which guidelines were given on the upkeep and restoration of churches. The law was written in close consultation with Hoyen, and it prescribed that any carved stone element from a capital to a baptismal font should be scrubbed clear of plaster, whitewash, or paint, and specifically granite voussoir stones should be cleaned, and then the grout between them should be highlighted so that everybody could see each stone and the connection between the stones. In churches built of less noble material, like brick, it would be advisable to paint over the brick to make it look like granite. In this context, Materialgerechtigkeit proved to have its limits. Some materials bear a deeper truth than others, even while they appear in an ersatz form. And these examples, it's very hard to see. I'm not sure that they are actually meant to be granite. I haven't found that in the written sources, but this is obviously, a fake stucco stone. But the greatest tribute to granite was carried out in the very body of the cathedral that was understood to have been the original source for the Jutlandic granite tradition, Viborg Cathedral. Having suffered 3 fires, especially a catastrophic one in 1726, the cathedral was largely rebuilt in brick. When Hoyen first inspected it in 1830, he found, quote, the old church standing like a mummy between plaster cladding and plain makeshift walls. And this is a view of the interior that he saw. Still, he saw in its extent crypt and granite remains the potential for a restoration. As he later put it, the edifice was one of our most venerable monuments, shot through and through with a sharply pronounced character, simple yet magnificent, and by its solemnity consonant with the mood in which in our days fills the ecclesiastical life. Hoyen's reading of the monument, influenced by Viollet-le-Duc's doctrine of stylistic unity, convinced him that the original structure was clad wholly of granite, which later scholarship has argued was likely false. It was probably largely built in brick already in the 12th century. The restoration began in 1864, and here you can see all the plaster had been removed. And Hoyen would end up working on it in close cooperation with the architect N.S. Nebelong until their respective deaths in 1870 and 71. The cathedral was in terrible shape, and the building was essentially rebuilt from the ground up. Among the many problems that emerged during the reconstruction was the sourcing of new granite. Denmark's remaining deposits were not sufficient for a project of the size, and new blocks had to be imported from a quarry near Gothenburg in Sweden. But the Archbishop Frederick Welding objected to the stone, describing it as dirty gray, dead and heavy, with each stone repeating the same boring and tiring sight in an endless monotony. So in the end, the Swedish ashlar was mixed with Danish, but that didn't prevent the overall result from being a catastrophic, overly zealous academic exercise in the expunging of a material past, and which, to boot, wasn't very Danish after all. The design of the exterior was adapted from Lund and the Rhenish basilicas that were its original models, and the interior was done after Michaelis Kirche in Hildesheim. This is what the interior looked like right after the restoration. This critique was the consensus judgment that emerged towards the end of the 20th century, together with the rising influence of Ruskin, William Morris, and the arts and crafts movement. This was the opening of a new chapter of historicist architecture, exemplified by the Copenhagen City Hall, completed in 1905 by architect Martin Nyrop, who managed to openly mix Italian, Northern medieval, and Renaissance forms, while laying claim to a Danish authenticity, again through materiality. In the words of art historian Francis Beckett, quote, "Love of old Jutlandic Granish churches had evidently given the architect the desire to wrestle with granite." The pride in that tradition of carving is also shown figuratively, for instance, in this bust placed as a window plinth on the western facade of the building, depicting the manager of the masonry company that carried out the work in the building. So by way of a very quick conclusion, I'd just like to take up the words of two historians who, in the wake of this architectural history written in the 19th century, sum up the attitudes to which I've given voice in this paper. Maurits Mackelprang, a director of the National Museum of Denmark, wrote in 1920, quote, "Our cathedrals cannot measure up with those of the larger world from which their ideas have arrived here, often in the form of halfway copies. In our parish churches, however, their ideas have arrived here, often in, these foreign thoughts have to a much greater extent been translated to Danish." And Francis Beckett would write in 1903, quote, "No other Danish buildings make on their beholder the impression that they were rounded by the land itself, that they are autochthonous, as do the Jutlandic Granish churches." Thank you.
Thank you, Stan, for your fascinating paper. And now we're moving to Poland. I would like to call Magdalena Kunicka from Jagiellonian University in Krakow. She was educated in Krakow while also participating in a number of international projects, mainly most importantly for this theme, an ERC-funded project, Art Historiographies in Central and Eastern Europe, from the perspective of entangled art history. And her research interests actually focus on history of art and architectural history in Central Europe, especially Poland. Magdalena, please.
Thank you for such a nice introduction, and I'd like to thank you for organizing for having me there and to show the context We were going to be there with Ada and with Anna Adaszyńska with the project of ERC project. Unfortunately, Ada died in 2020, and Anna Adaszyńska is now an immigrant from Russia because she is officially traitor and now spending her time in Bucharest and cannot travel anymore. So I would like to start that this presentation would not be possible without the help of the whole team. We still have friendship and relationship. Shona Karlstrup, Mirna Michał, Kozmin Minea, and Ada Adaszyńska. And I'm going to have some presentation also about problems of writing history of architecture in our region, because, and I think it's visible also here, that we have many polyphonial voices thinking about very similar things. And there's a problem in the entanglements of this history. So I will start with the Krakow context. Due to a relevant autonomy within the Habsburg Empire, as I suggested in abstract, and the renewal of the Krakow Scientific Society in 1856, and the urgent need of restoration of historical building after a great fire in 1850, Krakow became a proper place for scientific studies of architectural heritage. The phenomenon of manufacturing Middle Ages was also a part of research condition there. It can be there extended to a general theory of style defined in Krakow in numerous articles published at that time for contemporary purposes, and in terms of dialectic relation of general history of style and the national difference. Significantly, it was the history of architecture and the theory of style, and there's my stone to the garden of the relation of history of architecture and art history in Polish case. The theory of style matured with it, and the inevitably related structure of periodization discussed by me elsewhere that became paradigmatic for a newly established discipline of art history. This was accompanied by the development of concept of the monument, understood as a visible sign of the social life of the nation, or more literally, as a marker of boundaries between nations and between civilization, initially, as it should be emphasized, described not in the oppositional East-West pairing, but derived from notions of the Latin Church and post-Byzantine heritage, which is now extremely important during the conflict in the Ukraine. So I will start with the theoretical problem, national versus transnational. As I wrote, art historical narratives are understood widely as programs for training, displaying national art, creating a canon of monuments to preserve and research and so on, were used as tools for building nations, understood in terms of Benedict Anderson imagined communities. And this topic remained at the very center of research on historiography for over 20 years now, also in East Central European countries, and as Bakos stated, are slowly giving way to other issues, while the zenith of the research into the relationship between epistemology and ideology is almost over. Not so sure about this. We all recognize the situation described among others by the Accademia that modern art, quote, modern art history and nationalism grew up hand by hand. Also, the very dynamic character and constructive features of the period can be recognized when titles of most of the works dedicated to the aforementioned topics include wording that emphasizes agency, activity, or inventiveness, from Motherland in Progress, via Fabrique de l'Art Nationale, and writing and displaying stations, through manufacturing from Middle Ages mentioned above, to searching for the genesis of art history in Les Invasions Barbares. This tendency is consistent across the European intellectual field now. As I wrote here, a lot was done already, but it's easy to notice these separate and rather particular voices from very many parts of, especially East Central Europe. But it's a lot was already done. In Poland, from its very initial phase, if any liminal date could ever be identified, Polish art historiography build a coherent narrative of Polish art and Polishness in art in dynamic exchange between being Western, understood as a set of shared cultural legacy and values, but also of stylistic features, where main goal was the repositioning of Polish art within a rewritten universal history of art, expanding the territory previously covered by German surveys, as it happened, for example, in a survey as old as 1872. I will come back soon. The situation described above, by its nature, strengthened the assumption of the center-periphery model, which itself is a Western-centric construct, and did not work well in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, when the narrative models imposed in the acts of specifically defined auto-colonization. Let's provide some examples. One of ways of using architecture was putting this as a witness of national history, as in 1847, Józef Łebkowski wrote that the gray-haired old man looked behind him, remembered the traces of feelings that his youth passed on him as a legacy. And of course, these traces of feelings were connected with the monuments of many architectural heritage. Other strategies were adding by very mechanical way to the European heritage. The same Józef Łebkowski in his survey did a very strange thing, because he just added some Polish monuments to the many Kugler's book. Łebkowski, as I said, for example, adopted the strategy of transferring and autonomously translating the methodological and substantive achievements of Western art history and placing them in the Polish context. One of his chief goals was to reposition Polish art within the rewritten universal history, as mentioned above. Meanwhile, art history in Poland pursued two main ends. On the one hand, to demonstrate the distinctive and unique characteristic of Polish art, and thereby prove the autonomous status of Polish nation, and on the other hand, to preserve its kinship with Western Europe. In the contemporary language, the Hegelian philosophy of civilization, although Daniel Preziosi has described it as scattering as the brain of the Earth's body, Łebkowski's survey is like sharing the perspective of German Allgemeine Kunstgeschichte and textbooks by Karl Schnaze, Franz Kugler, Arthur Springen, and Wilhelm Lubka, many without any references in open words, and there is Kugler's handbook from the collection of Łebkowski with his signature on the first page. Even the structure of the survey was taken from Allgemeine Kunstgeschichte idea. The more loudly voice, even shouting, was taken by Marian Sokołowski, the first chair of art history in Poland, who wrote in open words. How far and when did Romanism and Gothicism spread eastward? To what extent did they influence the modification of Byzantine forms? Where did the line of demarcation between them lie, which was movable and uncertain and usually independent of political borders? Is a question of which is of interest to the history not only of our own Poles, of course, but of the whole of European culture, and to which we alone, Poles, can give an answer. And there is no doubt that in the absence of other sources for central epochs, the answer must depend on the study of architectural monuments, immovable and still bearing witness to these influences like border posts. The boundaries are defined by paths followed by Latin Christian civilization in certain epochs. The other strategy was also putting marking borders, like in the Österreichische Ungarische Monarchy Bild, of course a part of imperial policy of Habsburg, but using the case of Pantelimon Church in St. Stanislaus near Cali was described by Władysław Rutkiewicz as the last mark of the Western civilization. Let me come back to the strategy of writing in the region. The strategy of polyphonian voices and this national character didn't capture the specificity of the region. After this work was done, recently this national work, the focus of research in the history of art, historiography, concentrated on building a narrative in terms of the more horizontal of art proposed, for example, by Piotrowski, but not only, or more general and entangled histories of art in the region. In the issue of Umini 2021, Matthew Rampey, of course, in his very provocative style, asked about the applicability of those models to the history of art in the region. In this, there is the title, and he points difficulties in applying Piotrowski's model, presented by Piotrowski in 2008 in the text, also in Umeni. Rampey also considered that the use of the entangled histories, and I must agree, proposed by Vermeer and Zimmermann as problematic due to the periods-related inter alia to the complex linguistic structure of the region. But Matthew Rampey also rejected a network promoted by Israeli Frommel, pointing to a number of difficulties related to crossing the center-periphery model. However, he considered it most important to avoid the situation of parallel individual research conducted from the point of view of individual countries and nations. And I think that's our goal also. The scope of response to Rampey's paper was enormous. To me, the closest is the answer from Lena Baklova from Czechia, who points out that in the case of countries of the region, avoiding the national context would be losing sight of an important research factor, and she proposed application of Bruno Latour's actor network theory, which is also already done to that. Coming back to some propositions of the project, but shortening it down, we were trying to work on the region and the strategies with the three terms: periodization, style, and influence. We managed to publish only a book on periodization and look how Central and Eastern European art historians adapt, and respond to the theoretical and methodological issues developed well. And we were trying to bypass this by this strategy, this very national oriented narrative. As a style and the theory of style, we propose that it's many construct tool, as James Ackerman in his theory of style. Style is treated as a generalization which we form by comparing individual works into shapes that are convenient for art historical and critical purposes. And just to have a plot in writing art history, also Wojciech Bałos wrote in 2011 that the concept of style become a shield or an umbrella, we can name it, a way that allows us to look at an architectural phenomenon and make it something known and tame. And for me, the concept of style is also not only a construct but also a performative tool used for creation of national identity in architecture. And I have to show the output of the project. In some words, we identified that the concept of style in Central Human was like a dynamic relation between the general model of style and particular features or national styles, like ideal Byzantine shrine versus Franco-Venesca in Romania, vernacular origins, or Bulgarian Byzantine style, or 17th century revival in Russia. That was Anna was going to speak about, or the medieval past of the West, and our versions or I'm not going to speak about, I don't know, Zakopane style, but also vernacular origins of the national architecture and national style. For research on it, I would propose to use the model of the creativity of the periphery, created but used in art historiography by Lucien Malard, after, of course, Bartolomeo or Patrick, or seeing from the center from outside as used by Piotrowski. I just show a few pictures of these approaches, showing that these attempts were very similar in all the region, like the cathedral in Sibiu, like showing the ideal Byzantine shrine, like typical and very problematic and very archetypic for the national style in Romania church in Curtea, and also the beginning of the history of restoration in Romania, or the case of the building of a museum of national revival in Bulgaria, where we can only would easily recognize that the building of the museum has to be in the Bulgarian Byzantine style, not just in the very general Byzantine style. And finally, in case of Poland, the searching for a national taste in architecture had three or even more. I think that Barbara Arciszewska is going to discuss on it more detailedly. First voices around 1860, then efforts to specify but one particular style is a period between 1880 by 1907, and a kind of vernacular modernism architecture is starting to appear around 1900. And in these efforts, three very different approaches to style arouse. The first one, and very abstractive, is this one of Josef Kremer, who directly taken from Karl Schnaz's conception or concepts, and Kremer derives that art contains the qualities of morality, value judgment, and, quote, the highest elements of life of the nation. For this, he uses the archi-interesting metaphor of language. As I presented before, these monuments used by Łebkowski were also speaking in Polish, of course. I perceive a peculiar relationship between the heritage of art and language. It's from Schnaz. It is language that expresses the spirit. After once rejecting hypotheses about influence of climate, environment, and so on, Schnaz quoted art to the realm of language. Why? Language is a product of culture. In other words, it constitutes the image of the world. Language also constitutes the difference between nations, of course. Furthermore, the introduction of the metaphor of language allows art to be considered in terms of truthfulness. Art is not recognized purely by reason. Art is autonomous and represents an alternative, but not inferior to philosophical reflection, my way of knowing to the truth about the highest element of the human life and therefore about its spirituality. No need to add that for Josef Kremer, this values was mainly a national Polish one and also Catholic and only Catholic spirituality. The second, more empirical approach to the style were elaborated mainly by Władysław Puszkiewicz, very empirical studies on Romanesque architecture in Poland, published mainly in sprawozdania, so reports of the Commission of Art History in Poland. The first issues of sprawozdania contains mainly works of Puszkiewicz. And finally, the most popular version is this one by Filippo Kudinsky, who adopted also the spirit of Joseph Kremer, but he wrote in a more general way. So artism in general is always the higher representative of the spiritual mood and civilization of mankind, and this applies to every epoch without any exception. There is one exception, of course, and one goal. The goal was creation of Polish identity and the proof of life of Polish nation. I have to add that only nation who created autonomous art has can rebuild its autonomy. Strategies of choice, very fast, were also more general. The main question was, are there any exceptional individual features of our architecture? And the example is the collapse and failure of the two international Warsaw cathedral created by Adam Iskowski. Very critical reception of this building arrived very fast. So Polish scholars and Polish architects were chosen three strategies. So architectural romantic historicism, these vernacular modes, inventing national soul. We heard today, just a few minutes ago, about inventing national soul, and early modernism, or a kind of primeval shape of style and manner style. So this Polish feature were, for example, Visual river style projects as a counterpart for the style of the Orthodox Church, and this colonization by Neo-Byzantine style nearby in the Russian part of Poland. Competition for the church in 1886 with one condition: the church should be built in the pointed arch style, because it's a kind of Polish feature, and the paradigmatic choice of St. Mary Church in Krakow, and again Joseph Kremer, and our St. Mary Church is in its body and soul the representative of all our Gothic churches. Further, even small realization like church in Lutowo, there is this taken a similarity in towers used to show the influence of St. Mary Church in Krakow, or in more general way, the Krakow system in architecture, and the question whether the construction of 14th century Krakow Gothic churches can be considered a special feature of Gothic in Poland. These features were buttressed inside the building and connecting brick with stone element, and it was also used as a narrative starting point to create a national nuance of Gothic. Not only medieval architecture was taken into consideration. For example, we have also idea that there was Sigurd style, so it's a nuance of revival of Renaissance in Poland. It's very significant that the name of the king is used to define. Also, the king were really highly evaluated by the history, and specific features like column with the vase treated as a typical Slavic or Polish element. So, concluding, writing theory and history of style in East Central Europe is possible. We're recognizing common places and strategies and identifying local choices, but we should avoid the particular voices taken from countries which very often shared their history or had a very shared heritage now. Thank you.
Thank you, Magdalena. And our third speaker this morning is Barbara Arciszewska, an associate professor at the Institute of Art History, University of Warsaw. After her education at Cornell, the University of Toronto, she's now continue to work on historiographical issues on Polish art and architecture, after being focused also on British art and architecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, the organizers, for inviting me over. Thank you, the Academy, for staging this great event. And I would like to thank as well Professor Karge, my colleague Magdalena, for framing the presentation I'm about to give. And also I'm fully aware of the fact that this is the last one before lunch, so I'll try to keep it very short. So, architectural history played a major role in the rebuilding of national identity in Poland after the country's political revival in 1918, following more than a century of suppression of the Polish state. The narratives of architectural history offered valuable support for claims of cultural integrity of the Polish lands in their shifting borders after the two world wars, as well as provided much needed material evidence for constructing the foundations of the indigenous Polish culture. There are two distinct periods in Polish architectural historiography I will discuss in inevitably broad strokes in this paper. The interwar years were used to integrate the research on previously divided parts of the country and to emancipate, rather ineffectively, Polish architectural history from the overwhelming impact of German scholarship and its methods. Von Rumor's connoisseurship, Bauforschung, and formal analysis with its key category of style. The post-1945 period was the time when national concerns were intermeshed with the new class issues, so the Marxist approaches became the privileged way of accessing the past. The architectural historians of this time were also burdened with the responsibility of naturalizing the absorption of the lands previously in German possession, known as the recovered lands, ziemie odzyskane, suggesting their rightful return to the Polish motherland. At the same time, the territories in the east, the so-called borderlands, lost to the Soviet Union, had been largely neglected in scholarship until 1989, when another political change brought about a new academic era outside the perimeters of this present study. Architectural history has been traditionally perceived as less speculative and more rigorous than the history of art, largely because of technical aspects of architecture itself. Yet from its very beginnings, architectural history was heavily involved in a fundamental ideological struggle, a process of national identity building. Its objective methods were leading to strikingly conflicting results. The same impartial building archaeology and formal comparisons gave way to diverse theories about the French or the German origins of the Romanesque or Gothic, as architectural narratives became tools in ideological battles of newly defined nations. The modern concept of nation was a 19th century, largely Hegelian construct, brought to life in an age of social upheavals ending Ancien Regime, when tradition and the past were needed to prop up and legitimize the new power structures. To probe the national character of artworks and claim them as part of a specific heritage, contemporary art historians deployed two concepts of national identity, ethnos and demos. Initially, ethnos dominated, as scholars focused on defining the ethnic backgrounds of artists, their origins and native language, disregarding the fact that the place of birth and language were not sufficient denominators of national identity. In the 1930s, demos, concept considering the populace as a political body with shared culture, took over as better suited to justify the reclamation of cultural traditions. The focus on national characteristics of form was particularly strong in German art history, where a controversial term Deutsche Kolonialkunst was coined as a notion assuming intellectual domination of German elites in Central Europe and implying artistic impotence of the Slavic nations. This hegemonic vision of German culture, which framed the work of generations of Polish art historians, was also contingent on a clear supremacy of German-speaking scholars in the construction of discipline of art history itself. Polish architectural historians of the late 19th century not only used the methods developed by German academicians, but relied on German as a professional language, especially since Polish art history was developed in Galicia, province then under Austrian rule, where Polish culture enjoyed some autonomy. It is evident in the first modern handbook of art history published in Krakow in 1872 by a Polish author, Józef Łapkowski, of whom we already heard. His arguments came from the field of architecture, where examples of Polish Gothic appear poor by comparison with Western examples, as Polish architectural heritage is perceived as marginal. Not surprisingly, the next generation became wary of dependence on the national German discipline and its colonial paradigm. In his development of art history, Władysław Burzyński articulated the pressing agenda of Polish art historians who have, quote, a duty to explore our native patrimony to convince the rest of Europe that in the field of culture we moved along together with the people of Western Europe, and in development of our art, in each style we left a distinct national imprint. The Polishness of Polish art was therefore of overriding importance. To match German visions of history, Polish art historians, long before 1918, created their own model of supremacy of Polish art, rooted in ethnic concept of the nation. For some, like Karol Soczyński, even Titian and Rembrandt had the previously overlooked Polish roots. The renowned Limewood sculptor Wojciech Stos has also been reclaimed as a Pole, or at least a Swiss or a Silesian, anything but German. This was also the case of Benedikt Sandomierzanin, one of the masters employed at the Wawel Castle, who eventually proved, alas, to have been German. He is listed in sources as Alemanus. These ethnic reassignments were backed by attempts to define the genesis of indigenous motifs in architecture, rooted in folk and vernacular traditions, as Magda mentioned. After 1918, Władysław Podlacha, one of the leading medievalists, called for art history to express the depths of Polish selfhood, to prove that the reborn state was culturally autonomous, resting on a sound foundation of indigenous artistic tradition. In line with ethnic determinism, rooted in Taine's views on culture as driven by race, milieu, and moment, Podlacha declared that the objective was not only to define the idiosyncratic features of local art and architecture, but to demonstrate that Polish art developed independently. The debate which ensued focused largely on the national character of early modern architecture, because it marked the golden age of Polish culture under the late Jagiellonians. The Renaissance and Classicism as its hegemonic visual protocol were also the main preoccupations of early academic art history. The classicizing turn of Jagiellonian art around 1500 was particularly cherished as an example of precocious taste of the Polish elites, anticipating, not following, similar change in the German Empire. The effort to find the indigenous forms among universal classical vocabulary resulted in several discourses, of which perhaps the most influential was one focused on the Polish Attic. This striking motif was introduced into academic debate in the 1880s by by Władysław Łuszkiewicz, already mentioned, who maintained that despite its popularity in Poland, quote, the Italians were the first to cover the roof with this unsightly feature lacking aesthetic value. Of a different opinion, however, was the architect and theorist Stefan Schiller, incidentally born in a family of German descent. In his paper on the Polish attics and Polish reverse pitch roofs of 1909, he aimed to prove that they were a decorative and construction motif without precedent in all of Europe. In Schiller's view, the attic was an entirely Polish invention, first devised during the Mongolian raids in the 13th century to protect the primitive thatched roofs of the Slavs. In a collection of essays entitled, significantly, Do We Have Polish Architecture of 1916, Schiller posed a parallel between the development of the architectural and linguistic structures, again, that a parallel between architecture and language, typical of a specific community or a nation, and roofs were, again, his example. The main pool of indigenous architectural motifs was to be found, according to Schiller, in wooden vernacular folk building, its forms subsequently translated into masonry. Especially important was, in his view, the traditional daszek przyźbowy, I mark it here in red, projecting wooden eaves at the roof covering the gable end of the house, which was for him the vestige of traditional pyramidal roofs used by the ancient Slavic tribes, since then proved to be a false theory. The obsession of Polish art historians with the indigenous nature of the attic continued well into the 20th century. Wacław Husarski, writing in 1936, though hesitant about Schiller's theories, suggested Bohemia and Poland as the region where attics originated. A good example of one here. This myopic vision made Polish art historians disregard any examples of attics further to the west, because their presence in the narrative would imply conformity with the concept of colonial art history. This entrenched idea of the Polishness of the attic was repeated as late as 1976 in Jan Białostocki's authoritative survey of Central European art, where its origins were situated in Poland and Silesia, and the inspiration was said to have come from the local Gothic tradition. Thomas da Costa Kaufmann, who probed Białostocki's use of the concept, explained it in terms of Białostocki's subliminal sensitivity to, quote, German scholarly imperialism, end quote. The efforts to free Polish early modern architecture from the burden of foreign influence are also evident in the research on key, especially royal residences. We can invoke here the attempts to present the Wawel castle as an example of Sigismund style or of idiosyncratic Polish Renaissance, the product of collaboration between Polish-born artisans, the said Sandomierzanin, who, as we know, was German, and the Italians. The same process affected Wilanów Palace. The 19th century publications on Wilanów, like Skimborowicz's album of 1877, pointed to the contents of the house as the carriers of national values, the arms and armor of Jan III Sobieski, the memorabilia of Viennese victory. After 1918, the discourse shifted to architecture itself, as scholars tried to define the residence as a work of Polish genius. The national discourse is immediately evident in a 1928 work by Jarosław Wojciechowski, who identifies indigenous characteristics of Wilanów's architecture and downgrades the German input in its construction. His opinion could have been seen as a polemic with German literature, namely Cornelius Gurlitz's monograph on Andras Schlüter and his later work on Warsaw architecture under the Wettings. These groundbreaking publications, utilizing documentary sources extant in Berlin and Dresden, not accessible to Poles until the 1950s, as alleged by Lawrence, commenced a debate about the role of German influences in Polish art of the 18th century. For Wojciechowski, it was clear that the patronage of Augustus II in Wilanów was greatly overrated, as he redated the designs of the palace wings to the period after the king's death and reattributed them to an Italian rather than the German artist. The Saxon elector was not to be associated with any significant change to the material structure of this quintessentially Polish residence. Wilanów research highlights another area of nationalistic history focused on a specific building type rather than a formal motif. The restoration conducted during the 1920s confirmed the presence in Wilanów of an older structure, the original manor house or dwór, which was subsequently linked to the group of the indigenously Polish noble residences. This term was mainly applied to the type of a rustic single-story residence in timber, often with 4 projecting corner annexes which spatially and functionally derived from medieval manor houses, as well as from more recent Italian models, especially Servio and Cataneo. The multi-stage construction of Wilanów Palace and resulting changes in the spatial organization and the functional program have been subsequently discussed by researchers such as Starzyński or Czołowski in terms of a growing internationalization of its indigenous core, the old dwór. The preservation of old manorial seat, its form complying with the tradition of Polish land residences, has been considered as evidence of Sobieski's attachment to the Sarmatian ideals of the nobility and his cultivation of native virtues this building was supposed to embody. The association of Wilanów with those national and class values has been subsequently sought in some formal qualities of the house, such as the domination of the horizontals in composition or the distribution of masses close to the ground, all these apparently reflecting the precepts included in contemporary Polish architectural manuals, such as Jakub Kazimierz Haur's Architektonika albo Nauka budownicza gospodarska of 1679. As if national versions of Renaissance and Baroque were not enough, more localized regional varieties of early modern architectural idioms were devised. Among the earliest was the Lublin, an example here, and Kalisz, group of Renaissance churches defined by Władysław Tatarkiewicz as, quote, unique examples of indigenous Polish architecture. He used a typological approach to focus on the several idiosyncratic formal features, such as post-Gothic wall pier system that we've already heard about from Magda, and vault decoration combining Gothic layout with classical and egg and dart and astragal motifs, concluding that the indigenous nature of these churches resulted from Gothicizing the classical idiom. Around the same time, a Polish version of the Baroque was discovered, with its more local variants, the Vilnius and the Warsaw Baroque, defined soon after. The former referred to a group of spectacular Rococo churches in Vilnius and Lithuania, incidentally mainly the work of a German-speaking architect, Johann Christoph Glaubitz, whose accomplishments, in line with the ethnic paradigm, have been assigned to local builders such as Aleksander Wosikiewicz or Ludwik Hrynczewicz. The latter term was used to define the idiom used in Warsaw architecture in the 17th century, which was mostly produced by North Italian workshops. These efforts were backed by those who constructed a Slavic variant of the Baroque, such as a Hungarian scholar Endre Angial, whose theses were popularized in Poland soon after publication. Last but not least, a product of interwar scholarship was the Polish version of 18th century classicism. The style of King Stanisław August Poniatowski was another construct of art historians searching for a national dimension of the universal classical idiom. It was defined as a rather severe version of classicism adopted in royal commissions after 1783. Its most salient motifs, a compact volume projecting columnar portico, prominent architectural articulation in the interiors, as in the Palace on the Isle or the Warsaw Royal Castle, were provided by Dresden-born Jan Christian Kamsetzer rather than Italian Domenico Merlini, who preferred more ornate forms and colorful materials. In the writings of Tatarkiewicz, Mańkowski and Lorenz, all of whom adopted the stylistic term coined by Alfred Lauterbach, Stanislas style, this German influence was downplayed, however, as Merlini becomes the main artist associated with royal idiom, and through this Italian influence, the connection to the Vasarian canon of art history has been firmly established, legitimizing this Polish classicism. After 1945, the issues permeating Polish architectural history, the opposition to the concept of Polish art as colonial and marginal, as well as resistance to the hegemonic position of German historians in shaping the discipline, did not disappear. In fact, the hostility to German culture became even stronger in the wake of World War II. Incidentally, the concerns about expansive nature of German art history were also voiced at the time by the likes of Panofsky or Pierre Frank Castel, who in 1945 wrote about art history as an instrument of Germanic propaganda. Following a political shift to the Soviet-enforced communist rule, Polish art historians broke with former methodological foundations of the field. The idealistic framework of the formalism of Welfin and Riegel, or Panofsky's iconology, was replaced with materialistic turn and Marxist analysis. Marxist, incidentally, as we know, was also German. The object of study moved from the aristocratic Jagiellonians to the plebeian Piasts, with architecture of the Middle Ages becoming an important field of polemics. The so-called Piast vault, a term coined by Jan Sas-Zubrzycki in 1926, a three-point vault of thus far unclear provenance, became a new preoccupation. In response to claims by Dagobert Frey that there was a specific Silesian Gothic, Polish art historians formulated a theory about a Slavic origin of this specific vault arrangement, also present in Silesia, the region tied to the Piast domains until the end of the 13th century. Of critical significance was here the relationship between the three-point vaults in the presbytery of the Wawel Cathedral and similar examples in Silesia, including the choir of the Wrocław Cathedral. It was the case which allowed redirecting the traditional vectors of colonial influence, not from the west to the east, but the opposite. A fitting commentary to this national discourse was the work by a Czech historian, Václav Mencel, who claimed in 1948 that the very same vaults were in fact, quote, Bohemian jump vaults. The assertions that Silesian Gothic was an example of German colonial architecture were further crushed by Marian Morelowski, who in 1963 attempted to use an ethnic argument and redefined some of the masons of Silesian churches as Poles, Dalemir z Zajączkowa or Master Kieszka. Historiography became a critical tool of Polonization, conceived as a re-Polonization of Silesia. The frame of reference was the idyllic Piast domain, the archetype of contemporary communist state, molded according to the current Marxist ideal as a peasant paradise. The German population, which took control in later Middle Ages, was presented as an idle aristocratic or bourgeois class, suppressing the working Polish minority and eroding artistic production. According to Guido Chmarzyński, quote, the Hohenzollerns squandered the rich artistic tradition of Silesia, while Zbigniew declared that Germany and Prussia in particular was the most artistically sterile country in Europe, promoting ugliness and bad taste, end of quote. The already anachronistic ethnic discourse continued with the architect of the Hatzfeld Palace in Wrocław and Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, Karl Gotthard Langhans, identified as a Silesian with Polish roots, Długi Jan of Kamienna Góra. Such revisions of history were present in academic as well as popular publications, with newspapers and tourist guides playing a vital role in naturalizing Silesian built heritage as Piast, that is Polish at its roots. Similar concerns were guiding the selective restoration campaign after the World War II. The rebuilding and conservation efforts were directed at the oldest, truly Piast remains, such as the tower of the Piast castle in Opole, while the late medieval structures were not sufficiently protected or explored as representing the period after the separation of Silesia from the Piast domain. The concentration on the indigenous character of the Polish Renaissance likewise persisted now within a Marxist framework. The often naive vernacular classicism of Eastern Poland, Lublin or Kazimierz, represented now the real Polish Renaissance tradition rooted in peasant and townfolk culture and opposed to the elitist Krakow classicism. The focus also shifted to Romanesque architecture, explored already by Łuszkiewicz, as the expression of simple Piast culture, its regional distribution, allowing for incorporation of monuments from the recovered lands into Polish patrimony, such the cathedral in Kamień Pomorski, Kamień. By comparison with intense academic activity focused on the West, the research on the so-called Eastern borderlands from the 1945 part of the Soviet Union nearly stopped after the war. The architecture of these territories has become object of serious study only after the fall of the Iron Curtain, which opened a new chapter in scholarship. Yet, as a postscript, one has to note that even though the national biases of architectural scholarship have been recognized and debated after 1989, this reflection has hardly affected the research on the Eastern borderlands. Here, some aspects of the colonial Kunst have been perhaps unconsciously still applied, as Morelowski's opinion that Polish art was the force refining Eastern architecture has been shared by many scholars. The focus on hegemonic architecture of Polish Catholic elites in these culturally diverse territories served to revive and maintain the model of a civilizing process moving from the West to the East. It seems then that after a century, the scholarship turned full circle, responding to a redefined national agenda driven by post-Cold War sentiment and the need to salvage the endangered Polish patrimony. It is best to end this paper on a note of caution after Adam Miłobęcki, who wrote his 1952 dissertation on the Polish mansard roof, but in 1944 he warned his colleagues, quote, "It would be an audacity to demonstrate the existence of national architecture as palpable extract of Polishness. Such attempts would be doomed to failure." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Olszewska, for this wonderful paper. And now I would like, obviously, to open up a bit of discussion before lunch, kind of a hungry-ish discussion. It is a, yes, please.
Only a short remark for the last lecture. It's very interesting to see the nationalism in architectural history after the First World War. When we look to the West, we have the famous book from Emil Neuler. It's exactly the same. So I think we could largen our view in the more European context to see all these things. So thank you very much.
The radicalization of ethnicity of the architecture, both in terms of labeling its makers and in terms of labeling its forms or materials. And this is anti-Polish, of course. Yes, please.
Another remark, and to nationalize architecture can also be dangerous if we see it as a form of Yugoslavia, what could happen if it was too nationalized architecture.
No, me being a Croatian. Oh, okay. Yes, please.
So, in this point, it's important to differentiate in the periods of time in historiography. So, in the middle of the 19th century, there was more the tendency to construct more general styles, typologies, and so on, a bit more above these national borders. But with the decades around 1900, nationalism got new power. with the conflicts, with the military conflicts of Europe in that time. So that had its effect in historiography too. And so there are certain differences between these periods.
Yeah, I think we can actually talk about amplitudes. Because it starts off as a research on national support of national states, so it is very radical for a new society. And then it becomes a discipline, it searches to be more international, isn't it? At least this is my impression, in order to be equal as a discipline to more international hard sciences, which are on the rise at the same time. So this is a mid-century, mid-19th century, but then we have the other phases that we were basically discussing beforehand. Yes? Yes, Sarah. Yes. Thank you.
Microphone?
Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you both for those papers. I wanted to ask, I was very interested in what you said about the framing of the late Jagiellonian Renaissance style as sort of in contrast to German backwardness in the same period. And I wondered if you could possibly tell me when research on that material begins, and is it always tied up with a sort of anti-German sentiment, or does it start out as interest in a Polish style in its own right?
Well, as I've been trying to explain here, that anti-German sentiment is something that we can see rising around 1900. The research on the Wawel Castle is the kind of hotbed for that research on the Jagiellonian Renaissance being a unique phenomenon, because it was supposed to be an outcome of a close collaboration between Italians who were so proud as Poles that Italian masters, or rather Tuscan, were very proud of not northern Italians, but rather people from Tuscany arrived in Krakow around 1502, and there is no comparable cultural transfer to Germany at the time as yet. So Polish historians decided that this was the proof of Poland anticipating the Renaissance elsewhere in Europe. We were the first ones to host this group of masters from Tuscany and central Italy, and they have really created a kind of an imitation, if you will, of Tuscan architecture in the Wawel Castle, but especially the Sigismund Chapel. So here was an attempt to prove that their collaborators in Krakow were not Germans, and now we know that so-called Sandomierzanin was in fact German, because he's been noted in documents as Alamanus, not Pole-born in Sandomierz, as we were hoping that he was. So in a sense, that attempt failed to prove that this was a unique Italo-Polish phenomenon, this Sigismund style. Instead, we had a number of very important masons coming from Germany at the time, and they were introducing new Gothic architecture in, let's say, Collegium Mainz in Krakow. It was modern Gothic, I would say. So it was a kind of a different style from traditional Gothic. So we had waves of new architecture coming from Italy and from Germany. But the German current is really not acknowledged, because we wanted to be part of universal Vasarian narrative. We wanted to prove that we belonged, as you just heard. We walked together with the rest of Western Europe. We won't be pushed into a kind of colonial situation, only Germans giving us the patterns. We wanted to prove that we also had our Renaissance, our Baroque, and it was driven by Italians, not the Germans, and hence, as I say, very unfortunate. I'm still struggling with the management of Łazienki to acknowledge the role of Kamsetzer, who was by far the more important architect to formulate the so-called Stanisław style. instead it's continuing Merlini, because he was Italian, and Kansas was a poor guy from Dresden, and obviously we don't want to be associated with someone like that. We want Italians in our architectural history. So I hope that we can discuss the rest during lunch, I guess.
There was another question here. Yes.
Thank you so much. Just quick questions for Luca. Because I found your paper very interesting, especially the emphasis of Danish architectural historians on the Neolithic period of granite and how it was processed in the villages. And it made me think of similar developments in Danish archaeology at that time. For instance, of Niels Henrik Seestedt, who was the founding father of experimental archaeology in Denmark, and who was at the same time also very interested in Stone Age tools and Stone Age materials and how they were used. And he even had a small log cabin rebuilt in the 1880s just with stone axes and chisels and so on. So it made me thought of if there was like an intellectual exchange between art historians, architectural historians, and prehistorians during that period, or if we know anything about it.
Yes, thank you for that question. Actually, yeah, I visited that hut that was built at the time, and yeah, I mean Denmark. So I'm just kind of wading into the history of archaeology, which is very developed in Denmark, and even before the 19th century, there was a lot of activity around ruins. And it was a small circle of people who were working on both primeval Stone Age monuments and remains, and medieval. So there was, in fact, an exchange, and a lot of times the exchange was done through the same men who, there were always men, the same men who did illustrations for publications were often ones who then would write their own articles about it. So I mentioned Konobo was also J. Magnus Pedersen, who did the illustrations for the book that was written about the hut that you mentioned. And he went around with all the archaeologists, also the medieval archaeologists, the Stone Age archaeologists. They were all, and he made illustrations, and he also wrote. So there was a very tight circle of people working on these things. But I think there was a certain amount of preference for, or a certain kind of a sense of even greater pride, also in the intellectual tradition that the Danes had developed. The idea of Thomson, who developed the tripartite division of ages, the Stone Age, the Iron Age, yeah. So there was this was a bit more of a stronger kind of there was more momentum to that. That writing, that archaeological writing, than to medieval. Yeah.
Thank you. And the very last question, please make it a short one. I was instructed to be.
Yes, thank you. Perhaps I'm just making a short remark, because I think what is very impressive, and I'm sort of making this remark towards all three papers, because I tried to figure out this whole sort of set of arguments concerning the historiography of the Baroque in Germany between 1830 and 1933 in my book, Style and the Nation. And I think it's very impressive how all these arguments are so repetitive to a certain degree. As you said, it's a pan-European phenomenon. And I think the important point to realize is the problem of nation-state. I think the idea of the nation-state, which really came up with this subtle side, this area around 1800, really pushed forward the idea that we have to divide up Europe into all these different nations, and then all these different nations have the problem, and this is also the problem to define themselves, and all the wars which we have visited and which we are currently visiting again on this continent, they all have to do with this problem that we deal with history, which hadn't been divided up into nation states, but then from the beginning of the 18th century onwards, we have the idea of the nation state, and his art history is always part of this nation state building in any country, in every country we have been discussing so far. So this is just a short remark.
Absolutely, and the foundation of different teaching institutions for our history is also corresponding to this idea. So we need to wrap up for the morning, and thank you very much for this wonderful, wonderful session. I was instructed to say that we will reconvene at 3 p.m., not at 2:40, but 3 p.m., and we will discuss further on European Renaissance. Thank you.